Hello, welcome to the latest in Forward Meet the Poets. Here we're to welcome Nina Mingya Powles. I can just see participants starting to log in. My name is Holly and I'm the Four Prizes manager. And while we're waiting for people to log in, if you like, you can visit us on the chat and say hello. So if you hover your cursor over the screen, you should have a bunch of icons that come up underneath the screen, including a little chat symbol, and that lets you go over to the chat and you can say hello and say where you're calling in from. And you should also be able to see a link to where you can buy the book directly from Nina's publisher. Cool, I can see the attendees leveling out there. So I'm going to introduce Kim. Kim is one of our judges and she will be interviewing Nina tonight. The night will take about 45 minutes and she will be sharing questions that you have put forward in advance, but also one of her own. And also, if you have any new questions or things occur to you, you can also put those in the chat. Kim's first collection, The Art of Falling, was published by Seren. It won the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. She's won a Northern Writers Award, an Eric Gregory Award, and the Geoffrey Dermer Prize. Her pamphlet, If We Could Speak Like Wolves, was a winner of the Poetry Business Pamphlet Competition. She's a PhD candidate at Manchester Metropolitan University and is working on her second collection. Along with Claire Shaw, she is a co-director of the Kendal Poetry Festival. So let's welcome Kim to talk to Nina.
I forgot then, Holly, I've had to start my own video. I thought I had someone to do that sort of thing for me. Thank you for that. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to get the opportunity to listen to Nina read her poetry and to ask her some questions. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to Nina and her collection. She's a poet, zine maker and essayist from New Zealand, currently living in London. She's the author of a food memoir, Tiny Moons, A Year of Eating in Shanghai, and several poetry pamphlets. She won the Nan Shepherd Prize for Nature Writing in 2019 and is working on a book of essays about bodies of water, food, migration and being mixed race, to be published by Canongate in 2021. Her collection, Magnolia, my copy arrived only yesterday, which I was really excited about because I've been reading before it was published. We got this, and this is all the little tags of my poems that I really loved. I started marking them up and then I gave up because I ran out of space, and then I got my real collection, the real copy of it, which I'm really excited about. Look, the cover is absolutely beautiful. So Magnolia is a collection that concerns itself with how we negotiate language, how we move from one language to another, how we learn language and forget language, and what gets lost in translation. It's a book full of colours, which I think is hinted at by the fabulous cover that I'm going to keep brandishing to you. Colour and how we look at things and how we can name things is a theme that reoccurs throughout these poems. It's a book that's steeped in place, in particular the city of Shanghai. It's complex, multi-layered. It's a book to me that feels full of movement, between languages, between borders, between forms, and between memory and the present. I've really loved spending time with these poems. Perhaps one of my favourite things about them is their daring use of form. Nina uses a variety of forms throughout the collection. They are held together by beautiful lyric lines, but I feel like the poems actually push at the borders of what a lyric poem can and should do. It's grouped in broadly 3 sections. The first 2 sections are set in Shanghai, whilst the third explores what it means to leave a place and how it can still exist in your memory. I'm sure Nina will explain more about that later on. It's published by the brilliant Nine Arches Press, and it's very recently just out. And I'm going to hand over to Nina now, who is going to read, I think, the first poem from the collection.
Hi, thank you, Kim, and thank you, Holly. This is exciting and weird to be doing this on Zoom, but it's the first time I've read from the actual book, which is really exciting. So no more printouts of this poem, which feels really good.
Yeah, I think I was making a fuss about getting the book, but you've only just got the book as well, haven't you?
Yeah, 2 days ago. So I'll begin with the very first poem. Girl Warrior, or Watching Mulan in Chinese with English subtitles. 1. I remember the sound the sword made when she cut off all her hair. A sound like my mother cutting fabric, those blue scissors clutched in her small hands. I remember wondering why she didn't cut from the roots, a Disney princess kneeling in the smoke-colored dark, with straight hair, thin waist, hardly any breasts. Unlike me with my thick legs and too much hair that doesn't stay. Why don't we cut it short, she said, and so we did. But soon it curled sideways, ungracefully caught in the wind of some perpetual hurricane. 2. When I watch Mulan in Chinese with English subtitles, I understand only some of the words. My focus shifts to certain details. How Mulan drags a very large cannon across the snow with very small wrists. How the villain has skin as dark as coal, and such small eyes he has no irises. Once a guy told me mixed girls are the most beautiful because they aren't really white, but they aren't really Asian either. 3. After Mulan saves China, fireworks rain down in waves of multicolored stars. You fight pretty good, says her boyfriend with the big American arms. I have small victories too, like being kind to my body for one day, not checking my phone for your texts, walking home at night alone, not feeling lonely. 4. Why don't you ever write about yourself? And I didn't know why either. In Chinese, one word can lead you out of the dark, then back into it in a single breath. Shut off the light, as my mother and other Chinese mothers say. Now open it. 6. When Mulan returns home, the colors change from grey, blue, green to pink, warm yellow. There are plum blossoms floating in the stream. Her hair is still a little messy to make sure we don't forget. She used to be something else. 7. When summer ended, rain poured off the edge of elevated highways and washed away the moon. I no longer have a sword, but sometimes at night, I hold my keys between my fingers. I paint my lips. I draw avalanches. I light fires inside dream palaces. I cut my hair over the bathroom sink.
Thank you, Nina. That's really beautiful. It feels weird not to clap after that. And there's so much we could unpack just in that poem alone. I think we could probably spend 45 minutes talking about one poem. I really love the juxtapositions in that poem, and the movement between memories. And I think it contains a lot of the themes that come up later in the book. Films, the difficulty with learning a language. It's kind of maybe casual racism is the wrong word, but like a friendly racism almost that comes from people, not strangers, but people that you know. And the poem also contains one of my favorite lines in the collection, so I'm really glad you read that one. In Chinese, one word can lead you out of the dark, then back into it in a single breath. I think that's such a beautiful line. And leading on from that, I was wondering if you could maybe explain about the book's title. For those of you who haven't seen it, there's Magnolia and then a Chinese word next to it. And Susanna Herbert has said in the questions, could you also talk about the cover as well. So a kind of double whammy of cover and title.
I'd love to. Yeah. So the title took me a long time to find a title, but this one kind of captured what I wanted it to. So the Chinese characters after Magnolia mean magnolia in Chinese, and it's written in traditional characters, and it's pronounced Mulan. So yeah, the same name as the warrior princess, which means magnolia, which I love. Yeah, magnolias come up a lot in the book, but they are not on the cover. So that's a kind of interesting choice. But I just really adore this artwork, which is by a New Zealand Chinese artist called Carrie Ann Lee. It's actually part of a series. Her work is quite surreal, and she uses collage and like ephemera. She once described her aesthetic as like her Chinese auntie's attic, which I really identify with. So it's like a little bit kitschy, and I love the colors. I think it was the color more than anything that made me want it. This kind of weird ghostly floating moon, which I'm very into in the background as well. Yeah, so that's Carrie Ann Lee.
Brilliant, thank you. There's so many references in your poems that have sent me outside the collection to look them up, and now I'm going to go and look her up as well and look more of her work up. So I think the next section of the book you're going to read from is you're going to read part of a long sequence called Falling City, and we've only got time to hear part of the sequence. Perhaps you could explain a bit of the not the backstory, but you introduce a writer called Eileen Chang, who I hadn't come across before. And this is one of the references that led me outside down. It's like falling down a rabbit hole into someone else's work. And we had a question from James Gow, which kind of links to this. It says, were you inspired by any particular poets from the Asian diaspora when writing your collection? And did you feel any pressure or responsibility in belonging to part of that poetic lineage? So maybe you could a little bit about the background to Falling City, but also poets that inspired you.
Yeah, sure. So great question. I think there's a particular poet who I first read when I was doing my master's in New Zealand. New Zealand poet called Alison Wong, and she actually very kindly gave us a quote to put on the cover, which I'm still like a bit lighthearted. Not lighthearted, just feel a bit kind of faint about when I think about that, but she's amazing. She's like a living legend, and she's the first kind of New Zealand Chinese poet that I read and felt very much part of some kind of lineage. And then since then there's like more New Zealand Chinese and New Zealand Southeast Asian poets who I feel like some kinship with. But then I feel really lucky because I also feel a bit part of a community here in the UK of brilliant British Chinese poets and British Asian poets. Actually, it was in New Zealand that I first read Sarah Howe's book, which I know for many of us was like a really important book. And I mean, I think her book's very, very different to mine. But it kind of goes without saying that I did identify with so much of it. And that was like, it was 5 years ago now or maybe more, that came out. So that was really significant. But in terms of pressure, I don't so much feel a pressure. I think it's really, I feel lucky. It's more of a warm, welcoming feeling when I think of those kind of diasporic lineages. But I am conscious that to be a writer of Asian heritage means often being compared to those other writers of Asian heritage, even if our work may be completely different. And that's not always a bad thing, but is something that I try not to think about too much. Yeah, got lots of thoughts on that, but
yeah, that's really
yeah. Oh, shall I quickly
Yeah, so I think the Eileen, you write so well about other writers and artists. I think throughout the collection, and how I think if you want to find out how people have poets and artists have inspired your work, is the best thing is to read the poems, because they're kind of threaded throughout the texts, aren't they? And this next poem you're going to read talks about Eileen Chang, introduces Eileen Chang.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't help myself writing about a lot of other, especially women writers. Eileen Chang was a Chinese writer who was very famous in the 1930s when she lived in Shanghai. She was born in Shanghai, I believe. And later she lived in Hong Kong, and she ended up moving to LA when she was older. But she was a really interesting short story writer. She wasn't a poet, but I became very interested in her depictions of women in Shanghai. So that's kind of what this piece is about. And if anyone hasn't seen the book yet, this is my sneaky lyric essay that my editor Jane let me keep in this book of poetry, which is great. So, Falling City. The apartment building where the writer Eileen Chang lived in Shanghai stands at 195 Changde Lu at the corner of Nanjing Xilu. I found it one day at the beginning of spring, a month after I arrived in the city to learn Chinese. The women in her stories are not always likable. They are selfish, bored, cruel, petty, trapped in stuffy apartments and unhappy marriages. Shanghai traps its inhabitants easily, with spring rain that pours unendingly, summer humidity that smothers, drains. One night in June, my electricity runs out at 3 a.m., shutting off my air conditioning. I get out of bed and lie on the tiled floor, damp hair fanned out above my head, fingers spread out, not touching any part of my body. Every few minutes, I shift onto a cooler part of the floor that my skin has not yet made contact with. I drift in and out of sleep. A colloquial word for humid is men, which can also mean bored, depressed, or tightly sealed. The character is made up of a heart inside a door. I think of the women in Chang City, their curled hair frizzing in the heat, a halo of light around their heads. They sit by the window in dark bedrooms and hotel rooms, awake while everyone else is asleep, in silk cheongsams and cotton slippers with flowers embroidered on the toes. City of dimly lit windows and half-open doors. City of smoke moving through still air. City full of trapped hearts.
Thank you. I love that you said you slipped in a lyric essay, or convinced your editor to. I really like that, the Falling City sequence, and I'm kind of skipping forward to a question I was going to ask later on, but I can't remember where I read it, where you said something like you're excited by writers that slip between genres. You can be reading one type of text and think you're in one area, and then you slip into another, and that poem kind of feels like it to me, like sometimes one part I think I'm reading a lyric essay, then the next I think no, this is a prose poem. And yeah, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about this kind of hybridity with the genres that you enjoy working with.
I really do. I love being a little bit experimental and playing with form. I think Falling City, the lyric essay, is both prose poem and lyric essay. So I'm interested in the ways that it can be both. I think with me also I get bored really easily with like trying out the same form again and again. So I just kind of have to change it up basically. And I've got quite like a short attention span, so I'll try a lyric essay and then I'll kind of do something more, maybe like Girl Warrior, which I read before, which has got more space between the lines. Writers like, very early on, I guess I was introduced to hybridity through writers like Anne Carson and Maggie Nelson. Actually, I think Falling City was written really soon after I first read Bluets. You'll see the kind of the similarities and form there. So yeah, I'm really excited by that and always have been.
I definitely feel like it's a book. The first time I read it, every page I turned, I was thinking, what is she going to do next with the forms, in a good way. Not what is she going to do next, but wow, this is exciting. It felt like a really exciting book to read.
I really admire poets who will, like maybe write a whole book of sonnets or something. I've written one sonnet in my life and maybe more, but for those kinds of forms I find difficult, but sometimes I am able to like squeeze into those boxes.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to throw in another question from someone else now, from Sean Y. Keong. Because I wanted to ask a question about your other influences influences that come from outside, the influences you draw from film. But Sean Y. Keong says your use of references to other art forms, be that films like Mulan or food like dumplings, really gives your poem so much varied texture and senses. Has your relationship to these films or foods changed in the time since the poems were written? I've cut the question a bit short. Sorry, Sean.
Thanks, Sean, for your question. The answer is yes. I think it's inevitable putting something in a poem. Perhaps you kind of are unwillingly like memorializing it or making it into something kind of extraordinary by putting it into a poem, which can kind of which will inevitably change your relationship with it. And also I think just in terms of like the time that's passed, I think these poems like the Mulan poem and lots of the poems about Shanghai food were written during this really intense period of creativity and kind of self-discovery about 4 or 5 years ago. And so, yeah, and also, I know you're going to ask me later, Kim, maybe about place and memory, but like Shanghai as a whole, in my memory, is very kind of vivid and neon and poetic. And that's just like my version of that place, I think. And the same goes with these like movies. Dumplings, though, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I will always love dumplings, but I feel they're not necessarily things that I would turn to in my poems now. Maybe same with Mulan. Maybe like that's from this book and now I'm looking at other things. Perhaps there's only so many Mulan poems you can write. Maybe.
No, there's never enough. I think you're going to read a poem that draws from a film called The Great Wall.
Yeah,
I could hear that one.
Yeah, when I lived in Shanghai, I would often go to the movies by myself, which is not something I ever used to do, and I haven't really done that since. But movie tickets were really cheap, and I would go see these ridiculous movies that I wouldn't normally see, like The Great Wall, which came out in 2016, is directed by Zhang Yimou. Yeah.
You described it to me as a terrible action film.
Yeah, it's more than that though. There's aliens in it.
Right.
Yeah. The Great Wall, 2016. When Matt Damon saved China by driving his spear into the alien's mouth, I was distracted by Lin May's long braided hair and the way she holds herself so still, ready to strike down her enemies with a knife in each fist. But some things are fixed in the white savior narrative, like the exotic love interest who will risk everything as ancient cities crumble around her. And when you asked me what I thought afterwards in the autumn rain, I wanted to say, some parts were beautiful, like the pagoda of iridescent glass, shattering into pieces of pink and blue light, just as Lin May lets loose her arrow. And also when you whispered something in my ear and I was hit by the shock wave caused by my body and your breath existing in the same moment, in the same universe. Months later, you told me you cried during Rogue One, the scene where two men hold each other, weeping beneath the palm trees, and light beams blasting the leaves apart and their hands shaking, moments before a star-destroying weapon obliterates their small, wrecked portion of universe. I didn't know what to do with these space opera feelings, only that I had to exit this particular narrative in which our knees are just touching and we are laughing while the city disappears around us. As if we could reach back through hyperspace to touch the silver holograms of our past selves. As if we could go back to some other time on some other planet, before the first particles of energy let go of themselves, like the 1,000 paper lanterns released into the sky above the Great Wall, 1,000 tiny fires trapped inside.
Thank you. I love that as you're reading, there's people putting links to all the things that you're mentioning in your poems. Like we've got links to Eileen Chang, we've got links to the Great Wall. Don't go and watch the Great Wall yet. Stay in the interview. I've also been.
That link pops up. I haven't actually looked at that page. Yeah, that'll tell you all you know.
I've also been warned by Holly, who, well, not warned, but kindly told by Holly to not get too geeky about poetry because the book's only just come out and people won't have had a chance to see the poems on the page, so I can't kind of do a poetry geek thing. But I love, as you were reading that, I was kind of following along with the page, and they're kind of a long line and then a second line, the couplets, the first line and then the second line of the couplet is, what's the word?
Indented,
thank you, indented. And I just think the form works really well. So the second couplet is a long line. I was distracted by Lin May's long braided hair, and it kind of stretches across the page. And then the next couplet, ready to strike down our enemies, is a really short line with a knife in each fist, short line. So I'm geeking out and I'm not allowed to. Holly says I'm not allowed to. And I don't think can you see this?
This is an unusually kind of regular kind of poem, maybe, in the book. I don't know how that happened, but it did.
And it's all one sentence, isn't it? But you're just using the kind of white space to put the breaks and the rhythm in. It's fantastic poem, and the forms supporting the content like a lovely poetic scaffold. I'm going to stop poetry geeking out now, and I wanted to, there's loads of things I could ask you about as well. There's the Nan Shepherd Award. I don't know why I keep wanting to say Nan Tate. I don't know. Oh, it's because we have a Nan Tate Centre in Barrow. I've just realised why my brain's doing that. But the Nan Shepherd Award for nature writing, I was wondering if you could just quickly or briefly tell us a little bit about the book that you're working on. It sounds really interesting.
It's a book of essays, or sort of a cross between essay and memoir, because I can never stick to one thing. And it's called Small Bodies of Water, and it's loosely about swimming and migration and food and being mixed race. That's pretty much it. And yeah, it came about because I realized I had quite a lot of fragmentary essays particularly about water and swimming, and so I decided to try and put them together. And yeah, I hope that it will be something a bit different to kind of what you see when you look at the nature writing kind of section in a bookshop, which is a lot of the books are quite similar. So yeah, it's fun. It's really hard to write a long proper book. And yeah, and I keep trying to sneak like short poem-y pieces in. We'll see how it goes.
Is it working? Is that editor letting you sneak the poems in?
I have yet to find out. We'll see.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. So you mentioned that earlier on in the interview, you mentioned you'd only ever written 1 or 2 sonnets, but I think you're going to read one of the, at least you're going to read one of the sonnet with particles of gold, which again is a brilliant title. I think you're really good at titles.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is my 1 sonnet. So, sonnet with particles of gold. Today, scientists discovered the origins of gold. The sound of egg noodles crisping up in the wok. The garden carpeted in kowhai petals. The way my phone corrects raumati, summer, to rainstorm. The day after my grandmother died was white gold in colour. A star explodes and wings are found among the debris, along with pieces of a character I never memorized. Our only name for her. Poor, a woman beneath a wave. Drift, she mouths softly in English. What is drift? My mother translates into her language, not one of mine. I try to make myself remember by writing, pour over and over on squares of paper covering the walls, so I'm surrounded by the woman and the water radicals they hold close. The tips of waves touch me in my sleep.
It's a really, really beautiful poem as well. When I was reading that poem again, I was thinking about all the threads that run through your book and how these threads kind of hold the book together. And that poem, for example, you've got the reference to a rainstorm, there's water kind of running through it, and then the poem before that, April Kowhai, have I said that word?
Kowhai, yeah.
Kowhai. That's kind of got rain running through that poem as well. And I think a lot of poets, particularly at the first collection stage, are always interested in hearing about how poets put collections together and how they decide the order of the poems. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Was it thematic threads like rain leading on to more rain, or was there other organising principles?
Yeah, I did find that really challenging, but I knew that I think I knew I wanted there to be 3 sections, and I definitely always wanted it to be in sections. I really like kind of splitting up a longer work into smaller pieces. I like that as a reader, and it's very natural for me as a writer to think of the poems in kind of groups. So I knew that I wanted there to be a middle section, which is a long poem, Field Notes on a Downpour, which is like a downpour. So there's rain through the whole thing because rain is such a feature of, I think, the city of Shanghai. And I'm quite obsessed with kind of watery metaphors. And then in the end, it was actually a kind of chronological structure and also based on place. So the first section, a lot of those poems are quite written in the same kind of place and time when I lived in Shanghai, and then including field notes on a downpour. And then the last section is more like weaving between different places and thinking about memory. And they're slightly more recent poems that are maybe more concerned with in-betweenness and like longing. So yeah, it ended up, I ended up thinking of it as like Shanghai sections and then a floaty in between section, which is not a very poetic way of describing it, but that's how it went.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. I was wondering whether we could hear maybe the next two poems together, so we can hear.
Yeah,
is that okay? Just
definitely. So
I'm basically thinking about time, and that my next question was going to be more poet geeking about forward slashes, and I thought it'd be much better to hear more poems from Nina.
yeah, of course. I'll read the next two. This one is Last Eclipse, after an essay by Annie Dillard called Total Eclipse. She traveled alone. She crossed the mountains. She watched the landscape innocently. She supported her head on her fist. She felt strange birds in the trees. She touched an avalanche. She moved towards it. She waited without air. She sweated into the cold. She became volcanic. She heard the moon unhook from her teeth. She felt a piece of sun detach. She dissolved with blue light into orchards. She became a color never seen. She flooded all the valleys. She sensed the last sane moment approaching. Sorry, I'm really not used to flicking through this brand new book. This one is an older poem, Shanghai poem, Mid-Autumn Moon Festival, 2016. The city is turning, the trees are turning. We are walking and then swimming through a sea of yellow leaves when Louise stops to bite a perfect persimmon. Her front teeth pierce the skin, and she is laughing. I remember my mum cutting persimmons in the sun one afternoon. Soft orange bits stuck to her palm. We look up the Chinese name for persimmon on my phone. Shizi. We taste the word, we cut it open, wondering at how it sounds so like the word for lion. Shizi. Lion fruit. Like a tiny roaring sun. Shiny lion fruit. At dusk, we sit outside cutting mooncakes into quarters with a plastic knife, peering at their insides. Candied peanut or purple yam, matcha or red bean. The moon looks like a single scoop of red bean ice cream, but really it's a girl who ate her beloved, then swallowed the sun he gave her as a gift. Oh, there's always so much to be lovesick for when seasons change. Green bird cages and plastic moon goddesses and pink undies hanging up to dry above the street and boys who only text at night. We lick the sugar off our wrists and it's been so long, so long.
Thank you for that. I love the yearning in that poem. Yearning in general is my favourite emotion for poetry. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I wanted to in the first interview, forward interview with Ella Frears and Leaf, I thought Leaf asked a great question, and I I've decided to steal it in the hope that it'll be carried on to be stolen for every interview. And the question was to Ella, what does she want poetry to do to her as a reader? And I was wondering if you could answer that question.
I think what I want poetry to do to me when I read a poem is I want to feel it happen in my body somehow. So it's not about understanding in the normal sense. I think I want to feel the poem shift something within my body, and sometimes even like within the air around you, which sounds very strange, but I think you probably know what I mean. When a poem kind of lifts up off the page because it's doing something so electric, and there's a charge. Yeah, I wanted to do that, but I also yeah, that's the ultimate thing that I want poems to do for me.
That's a great answer. I was trying to think of there's a poet that said something about that sounded similar to that, but I can't remember who it was or what the quote was, so that's about as useful as I don't know.
I also think I have read, yeah, I'm thinking perhaps of
blowing the top of your head off or something. Emily Dickinson, blowing the top of
something like the top of
someone in the chat will save me in a moment. I know it because there's loads of poets kind of lurking about in there. Yeah, someone's just said yes, it was Emily Dickinson. Yeah, blowing the top of my head off. But I liked your description. Sounded kind of more gentle and less in the head, kind of the heart and the moving the whole of the body.
Yeah, I think for me it's often happens in my kind of in my stomach, in my spine, hands. Well.
Yeah, I know exactly. I think when I read Bluets for the first time, I had that experience. Bluets by Maggie Nelson. I think I was like, oh, this is just about blue, blah blah blah, and then I got to about number 6, and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. Yeah. Anyway, so we've got 3 minutes left, and we've got time to finish on it'd be great to finish on a poem to kind of send us on our way.
Yeah. This poem, it came about when I was living in Shanghai and there was a big earthquake in New Zealand. Thankfully, it didn't hurt anyone, but caused a lot of damage in November 2016. And so I was awake and like scrolling through Twitter, and the alert pops up that there's been an earthquake, and it was like the middle of the night in New Zealand. So I switched on the radio live stream for the like civil defense updates. Not great for my anxiety, but that's the kind of thing I would do. Like when you're far away, a strange kind of set of decisions can happen. And and I was like texting my parents, and this poem came out of listening to the radio through most of the night. The first wave. They request that we inform you immediately. You are standing on soft ground. The ceiling lights are swinging in the background. The waves crash, then dissipate. The first wave may not be the largest. This is a flow-on event, so do not go near, do not stay and watch the land slipping. It has triggered other faults like a network of nerves, and the seabed has risen out of the sea. There are visible ruptures running along the landscape. This is a flow-on event, but the moon does not cause earthquakes. The ceiling lights are a typical pattern of aftershocks, and they request that we inform you. You are a visible rupture running along the landscape. Do not stay and watch your nerves slipping. There will be strong currents in the background. The moon has risen out of the sea. The first wave crashes, then dissipates. you are standing on such soft ground.
Thank you, Nina. That's such a beautiful, beautiful reading.
Thank you.
And here's Holly she's gone again. Holly's going to wrest back control.
I am. No, I'm wresting back control of my computer, which flickered there for a second, I think you saw. I want to thank you, Nina, for fantastic readings and for such thoughtful answers to your questions. And thank you, Kim, for taking us through that. It was really, really wonderful to hear you both. If you're watching at home, you must buy this book. The link is in the chat. And what I'm going to do is, as we leave you now, we'll leave the chat open for a little while so you can copy or explore any of the links you've seen there tonight. We're going to be hearing from each of the poets who's been shortlisted for a book prize as part of the Forward Meet the Poet series, and we'll be back next week with Will Harris, and I will put a link to where you can see all the events coming up. But I think other than to say thank you once again and buy the book, that's everything for now. So have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.